He signed the papers before the ink was dry on his father's coffin. Ethan Mercer sat in that leather chair like a king who had already counted his gold, smiling, relaxed, absolutely certain the world had finally arranged itself the way he deserved. He had no idea his father had been watching him for years. No idea the old man had built a trap so elegant, so patient, so devastatingly precise that every move Ethan made inside that room had already been anticipated. Drop a like. Comment your city below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The morning my father was buried, it rained, the kind of rain that doesn't care about your feelings. Not the soft, cinematic drizzle you see in movies where the grieving son stands at the graveside with his collar turned up and a single tear rolling down his jaw. This was ugly rain, sideways, cold, the kind that soaks through your jacket before you even realize it's happening, the kind that makes you feel stupid for being outside at all. I remember standing at the edge of the grave and thinking, he would have hated this weather. Dorian Mercer had been a man of extreme preferences. He hated inefficiency. He hated softness. He hated mess in any form, emotional, financial, physical. He kept his suits pressed even on Saturdays. He kept his office at exactly 68 degrees year-round. He kept his feelings locked somewhere so deep inside himself that by the time the rest of us went looking, we weren't even sure they'd ever existed. I am Naomi Mercer, and I am the daughter my father never knew what to do with. Not because I was difficult, not because I rebelled or caused scenes or demanded things he wasn't willing to give. I was quiet. I was steady. I showed up. I did the work. First at the company, then beside him during the last 2 years when his health started failing, and the people around him started circling like they could smell what was coming. But my father was a man who respected aggression. He respected the person who grabbed the room by the throat and didn't let go. He respected loud, and I had never been loud. That was my brother's gift. Ethan Mercer arrived at the graveside 20 minutes late, wearing a suit that cost more than some people's cars, with an umbrella. Of course he had an umbrella, held at precisely the right angle. Not over himself entirely, just enough to suggest he cared about appearances without actually caring about the rain. He stood on the opposite side of the grave from me and didn't make eye contact. That was fine. We had not made real eye contact in almost 3 years. The last time we'd had an honest conversation, he had told me, very calmly, the way he said everything, that I was wasting my potential staying involved in the family business, that I was holding myself back, that I should let the people who were built for this handle it. He meant himself. He always meant himself. Celeste, our stepmother, stood between us like a human buffer zone, the way she always had. She was a small woman, elegant in the restrained way of someone who had learned very early that visibility could be dangerous. She had been married to my father for 11 years. She had never once, to my knowledge, raised her voice in this family. She had absorbed tension the way a sponge absorbs water, quietly, completely, until she was heavy with it. She reached for my hand under her umbrella. I let her take it. The priest said words, the rain said other things. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, I felt the strangest sensation. Not grief exactly, though grief was there too, sitting in my chest like a stone I couldn't swallow. Something else. Something closer to anticipation. Like the moment before a card is turned over. Like waiting. My father's attorney was a man named Graham Holloway. He was 63 years old, had been practicing estate law for over 35 years, and had worked exclusively with Dorian Mercer for the last 14. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and spoke with the measured precision of a man who understood that every word in a legal document existed for a reason, and every reason had a consequence. His office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown. Clean lines, good art on the walls, the kind of quiet that money buys. Not silence. Quiet. There's a difference. Silence is empty. Quiet is controlled. We were called in 3 days after the funeral. The reading of the will. I dressed simply. Dark blouse, dark trousers, flat shoes. I wasn't performing anything that day. I was just trying to get through it. Ethan wore another suit. This one, charcoal gray, with a pocket square. He looked like he was arriving for a victory lap, not a meeting with a lawyer. He was already smiling when I saw him in the lobby. That particular smile of his, the one that didn't involve his eyes, the one that said, I already know how this ends. Naomi. He said my name the way you'd acknowledge furniture, present. necessary, not particularly interesting. Ethan. We rode the elevator in silence. Celeste stood between us again, her hands folded around a small clutch purse. She looked like she hadn't slept since the funeral. I suspected she hadn't. The elevator opened. Graham Holloway's assistant led us down a carpeted hallway and into a conference room that smelled like leather and old paper. We sat. Graham came in 2 minutes later, set a thick file on the table, and looked at each of us in turn before he spoke. "Thank you for being here," he said. "I know this is a difficult time for all of you. I'll proceed directly to the terms of the estate, as Mr. Mercer requested." Ethan leaned forward slightly, just a fraction, but I noticed it. The early sections were predictable: charitable endowments, staff provisions, a bequest to a foundation my father had supported for 20 years. The family home in the mountains, which none of us had visited in years, left in trust for maintenance rather than individual ownership. Ethan was barely listening. I could see it. He was nodding along with the rhythm of the sentences without processing the words, waiting for the part he'd already written in his head. The part where his name appeared next to the numbers with all the zeros. My father's company, Mercer Capital Holdings, had been built over 40 years. It was not simply a business. It was my father's entire personality made manifest: disciplined, aggressive, profitable, and completely intolerant of weakness in any form. It employed close to 400 people across 3 offices. It managed assets in the hundreds of millions. Whoever inherited controlling interest in that company inherited not just money, they inherited power. And Ethan had decided years ago that this was his birthright. The primary estate, Graham Holloway began, adjusting his glasses, including financial assets, property portfolios, and controlling interest in Mercer Capital Holdings. Ethan's posture changed. He straightened. He was ready. Is to be distributed according to the following conditions. A pause. Is to be distributed. The word conditions landed in the room differently than the other words had. Something shifted. Even Ethan heard it. I saw the faint tightening around his eyes. Mr. Mercer left very specific instructions, Graham continued, and I want to be clear before I proceed, Bob. These are not suggestions. These are binding terms, reviewed by independent legal counsel and executed in full accordance with applicable law. Ethan smiled. Of course. Let's hear them. He sounded like a man humoring a formality. The first condition was what Ethan had expected. All existing family disputes were to be formally and permanently settled. No ongoing litigation, no pending claims, no challenges to asset transfers made within the last 5 years. Every listed document in the estate file had to be acknowledged and accepted without challenge. Ethan nodded immediately. Fine. I accept all of it. Ethan. I kept my voice even. We haven't read everything yet. He didn't look at me. It's fine, Naomi. I've already reviewed the structure of the estate with Father's previous counsel. There's nothing in there that changes anything significant. Graham looked at him for a moment, a brief, unreadable look, and said, I would recommend each party take time to review the full documentation before signing. I don't need time, Ethan said. I'm ready to proceed. There it was again. That smile. That certainty. The absolute bone-deep confidence of a man who has already decided the outcome. Celeste said quietly, Perhaps we should listen first. Ethan looked at her then. It wasn't cruelty exactly, the look he gave her. It was something more dismissive than cruelty. Cruelty at least implies the other person matters enough to hurt. Celeste, he said, not unkindly. You're here because Father wanted you here. But the operational decisions of this estate don't really fall within your... She is a named party in this will, Graham said. His voice hadn't changed volume, but something in the room went very still. Ethan blinked. All 3 of you are named parties, Graham said, in different capacities, which is why I'd ask that we proceed together and that everyone listens to the full reading before any signatures are discussed. Ethan sat back. He picked up his phone, probably to check something, to perform casualness, then set it down again without looking at it. Fine, he said. Continue. The second condition was where things started to shift. My father had stipulated that any heir claiming immediate access to the primary estate must demonstrate, not simply state, but demonstrate through documentation and third-party verification, that their involvement in the company over the preceding 5 years had been conducted with full transparency and in alignment with the company's stated fiduciary responsibilities. Ethan's smile didn't disappear. It just became something slightly different, a fraction tighter, a fraction more deliberate. That's a standard due diligence clause, he said. It is more specific than a standard clause, Graham said carefully. How specific? Mr. Mercer requested an independent audit of all significant transactions involving company assets over the past 5 years to be completed before the estate is released to any primary heir. The room was quiet, not the controlled quiet of Graham's office. Something else, something with texture. An audit, Ethan repeated. Already initiated, Graham said. Per your father's instructions, the process began 60 days prior to his death. I watched Ethan's face. He was very good at controlling his expressions. He had been practicing since childhood. I'd watched him do it, watched him learn the trick of letting nothing show when everything was churning underneath. He was exceptional at it, but in that moment, something moved across his face that all his practice couldn't quite suppress. Not panic. Not yet. More like the sensation of the ground shifting underfoot. Just slightly. Just enough to notice. 60 days, he said. Yes. He was already... Ethan stopped himself, recalibrated, folded his hands on the table. Why wasn't I informed of this? Because, Graham said, the terms of the directive specified that it be conducted without the foreknowledge of the parties under review. Silence. Under review, Ethan said slowly. Parties under review, yes. Ethan looked at me. I met his eyes. For the first time in 3 years, he actually looked at me. Not through me, not past me, but at me. And for just a moment I saw something there I hadn't expected to see on his face. A question. He wanted to know if I had known about this. I hadn't. But I kept my expression neutral because I understood, with sudden clarity, that this moment required stillness. Any reaction from me, any flicker of relief or triumph or surprise, would shift the dynamic in a way I wasn't ready for. So I just held his gaze and said nothing. Ethan recovered quickly. He always did. An audit is fine, he said. I welcome it. I have nothing to hide. He paused and then smiled again. That reconstructed smile, reassembled piece by piece. In fact, an audit will make it clear exactly how much I've contributed to the growth of this company over the past 5 years. That may be the case, Graham said. He kept his tone neutral in a way that was, itself, a kind of information. Ethan either didn't hear it or chose not to. So the estate is suspended pending the audit? He asked. The estate is under conditional hold pending review of the final directive. Another pause. Ethan frowned. Final directive. That's different from the audit. Yes, Graham said. They are separate items. He reached into the thick file in front of him and pulled out a sealed envelope. The envelope was standard legal size. White. Sealed with a wax stamp. Not decorative, just functional, just closed. On the front, in my father's handwriting, that precise, angular hand I'd known my whole life, were the words, Final Directive, to be opened at reading. Ethan stared at it. I stared at it. Celeste made a small sound beside me, barely a breath, and pressed her hand flat on the table. This, Graham said, was delivered to this office by your father personally, 8 weeks before his death. He requested that it not be referenced in any preliminary communications, and that it be presented only at the formal reading in the presence of all named parties. Ethan's voice came out slightly thinner than usual. What is it? That, Graham said, is what we're about to find out. He reached for the envelope and broke the seal. What? I need to tell you something about my relationship with my father before I go further. Because without it, what came next won't make the kind of sense it needs to make. Dorian Mercer was not a warm man. I've already said that. But warmth and love are not the same thing, and I think my father loved me in the only language he knew, which was the language of attention, of watching, of paying close notice to the things people did when they thought no one was looking. He had watched me for years. I know that now. During the 18 months before his health declined, I had been working as a mid-level director in the operations division of Mercer Capital Holdings. Not because my father had asked me to, not because I expected any recognition for it, but because I'd watched 3 senior managers leave in the span of 6 months. And I knew, that without someone stabilizing the operational infrastructure, 387 people were going to start losing things. Benefits first, then positions. I went in. I fixed the systems. I stayed late. I answered emails at midnight. I rebuilt relationships with 2 vendors we'd nearly lost and renegotiated a service contract that was costing the company a frankly absurd amount of money. Nobody gave me a raise for this. Nobody moved my name up any visible list. But my father called me into his office one afternoon, about 8 months before he died, and sat across from me in that oversized chair of his and looked at me for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "You stayed." 2 words. That was all. I said, "Of course I stayed." He nodded once, slowly, and looked out the window. "Your brother," he said carefully, "has different priorities." I didn't respond. I wasn't going to walk into that with him. "I've made mistakes," he said then, and that surprised me so much that I didn't even know how to absorb it in the moment. My father did not say that. Dorian Mercer did not have the vocabulary of mistakes. He had the vocabulary of lessons, of adjustments, of strategic recalibrations. But there it was. I've made mistakes. He didn't specify which ones. He didn't look at me when he said it, and 2 minutes later he was back to talking about the quarterly figures, and the moment closed around itself like water over a stone. I thought about that conversation for months afterward. I think about it still. Graham Holloway. Read the final directive. The way you'd read something that could break things if handled carelessly. Not slow, not dramatic, just precise. The first section was a summary of findings from an internal investigation, conducted discreetly over a period of nearly 2 years, with the assistance of a forensic accounting firm that my father had engaged through an independent channel. The investigation had been centered on anomalies identified in the company's financial records, specifically a pattern of asset transfers that had been structured over time to appear routine. They were not routine. As Graham read the details, I found myself gripping the edge of the conference table, not from shock, not entirely, but from the specific nauseating sensation of hearing something confirmed that you had always almost known but could never prove. Transfers routed through a subsidiary that Ethan had established, quietly, efficiently, using his signatory authority as COO. Transfers that had reduced the value of a particular company division by approximately 17% over a 4-year period. A division that had subsequently been targeted for external acquisition by a firm in which Ethan held a private, undisclosed interest. The acquisition would have allowed Ethan to effectively purchase a portion of his own father's company at a deflated price he had personally engineered, using value he had personally extracted. The room didn't get loud. It got very, very small. Ethan was absolutely still. I don't know what I'd expected from him in that moment. Denial, maybe. Anger. The particular kind of aggression he deployed when he felt cornered. Something loud and defensive that would at least fill the air. What I got was silence. Just silence. Graham continued reading. In addition to the financial records, the directive contained a series of letters. Personal letters, from my father to Graham, written over the preceding 2 years. Not accusations, documentation, observations, dates, times, decisions, conversations. My father writing down what he saw, in his careful, angular hand, the way an architect documents the measurements of a structure he's about to take apart. He had known. He had known for years, and he had said nothing to Ethan, said nothing to me, just watched and documented and waited, and finally, built a legal instrument so precise and so patient and so completely devastating that it could undo everything Ethan had spent years constructing, in a single afternoon, in a lawyer's conference room on the 14th floor, in the rain. This is, Ethan's voice came back to him slowly, like someone locating a thing they'd dropped in the dark. There are inaccuracies in this document, significant ones. I want to be very clear about that. You'll have the opportunity to respond through proper legal channels, Graham said. I'm responding now. Ethan's voice was sharper. The control was starting to cost him more than he had to spend. My father was in declining health. His judgment in the final months was, the directive was executed 8 weeks prior to his death, Graham said. At the time, your father was assessed as being of sound mind and judgment by 3 independent evaluators. That assessment is part of the record. Ethan looked at me. I don't know what he saw on my face. Whatever it wasn't what he needed. Naomi, He said my name differently now. Not furniture, something else. You knew about this. I didn't, I said. You had to. You've been. He stopped, started again. You've been in his ear for months. I know you have. The whole time I was trying to grow this company, you were in there working on him, turning him against Ethan. My voice was quiet. Stop. He's gone. Something broke open in Ethan's voice then. Not grief. Something harder and uglier than grief. He's gone, and now you're going to sit there and pretend this isn't exactly what you wanted? That this entire performance wasn't designed to Ethan. Celeste's voice, barely above a whisper. He stopped. She hadn't looked up from the table. Her hands were still flat against the surface, but her voice had something in it that none of us were used to hearing from her. Something final. He knew, she said. Your father knew. And he chose to do this. Not Naomi. Not me. Him. Whatever you do with that is your business. But don't you sit in this room and turn it into something it isn't. Silence. Ethan looked at his stepmother for a long moment. And for just a fraction of a second, so brief I almost missed it, I saw the expression on his face shift into something almost unrecognizable, something like a boy who had just been told a truth he wasn't ready for. Then it was gone, and the room went quiet again. What? Graham completed the reading of the directive. The inheritance was suspended pending the outcome of the audit and any resulting legal proceedings related to the documented asset transfers. Ethan's operational access to Mercer Capital Holdings was to be placed under immediate review by the board. And then, the part that made the air in the room change completely, Graham looked up from the document, looked directly at me, and read the final paragraph. My father's words. In his voice, even filtered through Graham's careful delivery, I recognized the rhythm of his sentences, the architecture of how he thought. He had written that the ultimate distribution of the estate, in the event of findings consistent with what the directive described, would be determined not by birth order, not by gender, not by who had been louder or more aggressive or more present in the formal meetings, but by who had actually served the company, who had protected the people who depended on it, who had stayed when staying was hard, and done the work when the work was invisible, and held things together not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. He had written, and I am not going to pretend I didn't feel this in my body, he had written, Naomi has always known what this company was for. I was too proud to tell her that while I still could. This is the only way I know how to say it now. I pressed my hand to my mouth. I didn't cry. Not there. Not in that room with the leather chairs and the quiet, and Ethan sitting 3 feet away from me going absolutely still. But I felt something crack open in my chest that I hadn't expected to feel. Something that had been sealed shut for so long I'd forgotten it was there. Relief. Not triumph. Not vindication. Just relief. Like a weight I hadn't known I'd been carrying had finally been set down. The meeting ended with legal formalities I can barely remember. Forms to be signed, copies to be made. Graham explaining the next steps in measured, careful sentences that I absorbed maybe 40% of. Ethan left without speaking to me. He walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and stood with his back to the room. He didn't look back. The elevator opened, he stepped in, and the doors closed, and that was it. Celeste and I stood in the hallway for a moment. She looked smaller than usual, which I hadn't thought was possible. The formality she usually carried as armor seemed to have been set aside somewhere along the way. She looked tired. Not the tired of a bad night's sleep, the tired of years. Are you all right? I asked her. She let out a long breath. I've been waiting for this for a long time, she said. Not like this. Not exactly. But for something. For it to stop just sitting there, under everything. I know. Your father, she started. Stopped. Started again. He wasn't. I know, I said again, softly. She nodded. She straightened. Put her armor back on. I could see her do it, piece by piece, the way you'd pick up things you'd had to set down to get through a doorway. I'm glad you were there today, she said. I'm glad you were too. She reached out and briefly, lightly, touched my arm. Then she was gone. I stood in Graham Holloway's empty hallway for another minute or two, by myself. The carpet was very quiet under my feet. The art on the walls was expensive and impersonal. Outside the window at the end of the hall, the rain had finally stopped, and the city below was that particular shade of gray-silver that only shows up right after bad weather, clean and raw and somehow more honest than the sky it usually shows. My father had watched me work for 2 years without telling me he saw. He had built something intricate and patient and devastating, not out of cruelty, not entirely, but out of a combination of pride and love and the inability to say the simple things while he was still breathing. He had made mistakes. He told me so himself, in that careful, minimal way of his. This was his attempt at a correction. It was not perfect. None of it was perfect. The years I'd spent feeling invisible in this family were not going to be undone by a sealed envelope in a law office. The relationship I'd lost with my brother, whatever version of a relationship it had ever been, was not going to be repaired by documents and board reviews. The damage was real. It had always been real. But my father had seen me. Finally, imperfectly, far too late. He had seen me. And as I walked to the elevator and pressed the button and watched the doors open onto the ordinary, complicated, uncertain future, I held on to that, just that. For now. It was enough. The elevator ride down from the 14th floor took approximately 45 seconds. I know because I counted. Not intentionally. It's just what my brain did when it needed something concrete to hold on to, something measurable and finite and completely indifferent to the wreckage of the last 2 hours. The numbers on the panel lit up one by one. 14, 13, 12. The soft mechanical hum of a system doing exactly what it was designed to do, completely unaware that the woman inside it had just had her entire understanding of her family rearranged. 11, 10, 9. I thought about my father's handwriting on that envelope. I thought about Ethan's face when Graham read the transfer records. I thought about Celeste saying he knew in that voice I had never heard from her before. That final, quiet, tired voice of a woman who had been holding something heavy for a very long time and had just, in that one moment, set it down. The lobby was all marble and light. People moved through it with the brisk, purposeful energy of people who had somewhere to be and no reason to stop. I pushed through the revolving door and stepped out onto the wet sidewalk and stood there for a moment, breathing air that smelled like rain and exhaust, and the particular cold sharpness of a city that had just been cleaned against its will. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I already knew, before I looked at it, that it was Ethan. I was wrong. It was his attorney, a man named Philip Garrett, who I had met exactly once at a company function 3 years ago and had immediately disliked in the vague, instinctive way you sometimes dislike people before you have specific evidence to support it. The text was brief, professional, aggressively so. Ms. Mercer, my client would like to request a meeting at your earliest convenience to discuss the contents of this morning's proceedings. Please advise on your availability. I stood on the wet sidewalk and read it twice. Then I put my phone back in my pocket and walked to my car. I didn't respond that day. I want to be honest about that. Not because it was the morally superior choice, but because the truth is that I simply did not have anything left in me for Ethan that afternoon. The day had taken everything I had just to get through, and the idea of walking into another room with him and his attorney and whatever version of reality they were already constructing felt like being asked to run a race on a broken ankle. I drove home. I made tea I didn't drink. I sat at my kitchen table in the dark for a while without turning any lights on, and I thought about my father. Not the father from the conference room, not the father of documents and directives and 40 years of accumulated financial architecture. The other one. The one I'd caught glimpses of, rarely, briefly, in the spaces between his armor. The one who had said, "I've made mistakes," and then looked out the window. I wondered if he had known, at that moment, how much I needed him to say more. Whether he'd had any idea at all what those 2 words cost me to hear, and how much the silence that followed them cost me too. Probably not. That was the thing about my father. He was extraordinary at building systems, and terrible at understanding what the people inside those systems actually needed from him. He could engineer a legal instrument precise enough to dismantle his son's deception from beyond the grave. He could not, while living, tell his daughter that he saw her. I don't say that to be cruel to his memory. I say it because it's true. And the truth, even when it's uneven and uncomfortable, is the only thing I know how to work with. Why? The call from Marcus Webb came 2 days later. Marcus was the chairman of Mercer Capital Holdings' board of directors, a position he'd held for 11 years, which meant he'd known my father almost as long as Celeste had, and in some ways probably understood him better. He was a compact, direct man in his early 60s who had never once, in all the years I'd known him, wasted a sentence. "Naomi," he said when I picked up, "I need you to come in." "Marcus, not a request," he said. Not unkindly, just factually. "I know," I said. "When?" "Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. I was there at 7:50. The Mercer Capital Holdings offices occupied 3 floors of a building 12 blocks from Graham Holloway's. I had walked those halls more times than I could count, first as Dorian Mercer's daughter, which meant something specific and not entirely comfortable, and later as a director in operations, which meant something different and cost a great deal more. The building felt different that morning, or maybe I was different, and the building was just reflecting it back at me. The receptionist, a young woman named Priya, who had always been professionally warm, looked at me with an expression she was clearly trying to control, something caught between sympathy and curiosity, and the careful blankness of someone who understood that the wrong reaction could become its own problem. "Good morning, Miss Mercer," she said. "Morning, Priya." Marcus's office was on the top floor. Corner position, windows on 2 sides, a view that on a clear day extended far enough to make you feel, briefly, like the scale of things was different than you usually experienced it. That morning the sky was overcast. Everything outside the glass looked gray and very close. Marcus was already at his desk when I walked in. He stood, which he didn't always do, and gestured to the chairs across from him. "Sit." I sat. He came around the desk and sat in the chair beside me, rather than returning to his position across it. That was information. Marcus Webb communicated a great deal through spatial arrangement. "I'm going to be direct with you," he said. "Please." The board was informed yesterday of the contents of the final directive. Graham Holloway presented a summary. Not the full document, but enough. We've also been briefed on the scope of the audit. He paused. "Naomi, some of us were aware that something was being investigated. Your father confided in me, partially, about 8 months ago. I didn't know the full extent of what he'd found." I watched him. "What I did know," Marcus continued, "was that he was concerned about the trajectory of certain decisions, about the direction certain things were heading." He stopped, seemed to choose his next words deliberately. "He talked about you." That landed somewhere tender. "What did he say?" I asked, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. "He said you were the only one who had treated this company like it belonged to the people who worked in it." Marcus's expression didn't shift much. It rarely did. But something in his eyes was direct and serious in a way that felt like respect rather than performance. He said that was rarer than it should be. I looked at the gray sky outside the window for a moment. "He never told me that," I said. "No," Marcus said. "He wouldn't have." And there it was. My father, summarized in 5 words by a man who had known him for over a decade. He wouldn't have. Not he didn't get the chance, or he meant to, or any of the softer constructions people reach for when they're trying to be kind. Just the plain, accurate truth of who my father was. He wouldn't have. "What does the board need from me?" I asked. Marcus leaned forward slightly. "Ethan has already made contact, through his attorney." I wasn't surprised. I'd been expecting it since Philip Garrett's text 2 days ago, which I still hadn't answered. "He's disputing the directive," Marcus said, "claiming diminished capacity, undue influence. He's throwing things at the wall right now to see what sticks. And his attorney is smart enough to make noise that sounds credible even when it isn't. He'll challenge the audit too," I said. "He already has. Formally, yesterday afternoon." Marcus sat back. "Here's where we are, Naomi. The company is in a stable position operationally, thanks in no small part to the work you did in the operations division over the last year and a half. But the board cannot sit in neutral while a contested estate proceeding drags on for months. We need leadership that is functional and visible." I understood what he was saying before he finished saying it. "You want me to take an active role," I said. "I want you to take the role you were already doing, but with the authority that role actually requires." He paused. "The board is prepared to appoint you as interim director of operations with expanded authority, pending resolution of the estate. It's not the trustee position yet. That comes with the estate when it's settled. But it's not nothing." It was not nothing. It was, in fact, considerably more than nothing. "And Ethan?" I asked. Marcus's expression didn't change. "Ethan's operational access has been suspended pending the audit review. As of yesterday, he is not authorized to execute transactions, sign documents, or represent the company in any formal capacity. I thought about Ethan at 26, walking into our father's company for the first time in a suit that fit him perfectly, shaking every hand in the room, turning on a smile that worked on almost everyone. I thought about how effortless it had looked, how certain he'd seemed, not just confident, but genuinely, fundamentally certain that the world was arranged in his favor. I thought about his face in Graham Holloway's conference room. Okay, I said. Okay, you'll do it? Okay, I'll do it. Marcus nodded. Once. He picked up a folder from the table and held it out to me. You'll want to read through the operational briefings before Monday. There are some things that need attention, some things that weren't being attended to the way they should have been. I took the folder. I knew what he meant. I knew there would be things in there, small decisions, redirected resources, quiet erosions, that bore Ethan's fingerprints. Things that hadn't seemed significant in isolation, but would form a pattern once you laid them out together. My father had seen that pattern. He'd been watching it form for years. And instead of confronting it while he still had time, instead of sitting his son down and saying, I see what you're doing and it ends now, he documented it. Patient, meticulous, exhaustive documentation, then sealed it and handed it to his attorney and walked away and eventually died. I don't know if that was wisdom or avoidance. Maybe it was both at once. Maybe it didn't matter. 3 days after the board meeting, Ethan called me directly. Not through his attorney, not through a formal channel, just my phone rang, and his name was on the screen, and I stood in my kitchen holding it for 4 full rings before I answered. Naomi. His voice was different, not the conference room voice, controlled and recalibrating, and not the old voice either, the one from years ago, before everything calcified between us. Something in between. Something tired and stripped of its usual gloss. Ethan, I need to talk to you. A pause. Not through lawyers. I didn't say anything. I know you're angry, he said. I'm not angry, I said, and it was true, which surprised me a little even as I said it. I'm not angry, Ethan. I'm tired. There's a difference. A silence. Can we meet? He asked. I thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, not as a performance of consideration, but as an actual internal deliberation. Part of me, the part that had spent a childhood wanting things from Ethan that he never had the capacity to give, said no. Protect yourself. You've just been handed something you've been working toward for years, and the last thing you need is to walk it into a room with him and watch him try to take it apart. But another part of me, the part that had stood at my father's grave in the ugly rain and felt the specific grief of someone who had lost the chance to say things that needed saying, thought about what it would cost me, long term, to close this door entirely. Not for him. For me. Coffee, I said. Public place. No attorneys. Another silence. Shorter. All right, he said. We met the following morning at a place neither of us had any history with. A coffee shop on the east side that was perfectly ordinary, which was exactly what I wanted. No symbolism, no associations, just 2 people in a booth with paper cups between them. Ethan looked like he hadn't been sleeping. I'd seen him look bad before, usually briefly, in moments he couldn't control, before he reassembled. But this was different. This was the look of someone who had been alone with the truth of himself for several days straight, and hadn't found a way to make peace with it yet. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He didn't drink from it. I'm not going to apologize, he said, if that's what you're waiting for. I'm not waiting for anything, I said. Philip thinks I have a real case. The diminished capacity argument. Ethan, I kept my voice level. Your father was assessed by 3 independent evaluators. He had been building that directive for almost 2 years. There was nothing diminished about his capacity. Ethan's jaw tightened. You're going to spend a lot of money, I continued, fighting something that is extremely well constructed by a man who spent 40 years building things that were hard to undo. And at the end of it, you're not going to win. You're going to be exactly where you are now, except poorer and further from any possibility of this ever being repaired. The word repaired sat between us. Ethan looked at his coffee cup for a long time. He built a trap, Ethan said quietly. Not accusing, just stating. He built accountability, I said. There's a difference. He could have come to me. Something shifted in Ethan's voice, something underneath the control, something raw and unprocessed. If he knew, if he'd been watching all that time, he could have said something. He could have sat me down and told me what he'd found and given me a chance to... He stopped himself. I waited. To what? I asked very carefully. He didn't answer, which was, in its way, an answer. Because what was the end of that sentence? Given me a chance to explain it away? Construct a better cover? Use the relationship to make him doubt what he'd seen? Ethan was smart enough to know how that sentence ended. He was just not quite ready, yet, to say it out loud. He loved you, I said, in the way he knew how. Ethan made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He loved the idea of what he wanted me to be, he said. That's different. And the thing was, the genuinely complicated, genuinely human thing was that he wasn't entirely wrong about that. My father had loved the potential of Ethan, the projection of himself he'd seen in his son's aggression and ambition and refusal to back down. He had loved that, and in doing so he'd given Ethan just enough rope. But that wasn't the whole truth either. He also saw what you actually were, I said, and he still... I paused, chose carefully. He didn't destroy you, Ethan. He could have taken this to prosecutors. He could have gone public. He could have cut you out entirely with no provision, no path, nothing. He didn't do any of that. Ethan looked up at me. There's a provision in the directive, I said. Graham would have told you if you'd stayed to hear the whole reading. What provision? I held his gaze. There's a path, I said. In the language of the directive, if the audit findings result in restitution, voluntary restitution, not court-ordered, and if there's a demonstrated, documented period of accountability, the board has the authority to revisit the estate terms. Not fully, not everything, but something. The silence in that coffee shop was very full. He built that in, Ethan said slowly. He built that in, I confirmed. Ethan sat with that for a moment. The coffee shop moved around us. Someone's order called. A door opened and let in a brief ribbon of cold air. Two women at the next table laughed at something on a phone screen. Ordinary life, completely indifferent to the conversation happening 3 feet away from it. Why are you telling me this? Ethan asked. I thought about it honestly before I answered. Because he was our father, I said. And whatever he was, whatever he got wrong, whatever damage he did by not being what either of us needed, he was trying, at the end, to leave us something better than what we had. I think the least I can do is not waste that. Ethan looked at me for a long time. I wasn't the Ethan from the conference room. He wasn't the Ethan from the elevator lobby, or the company hallways, or any of the versions I'd been carrying of him for the last several years. He was something smaller and less certain and more real. He was just a person sitting across a table from his sister. I don't know how to do what you're describing, he said, and his voice, for the first time I could remember, had no performance in it at all. I don't know how to be the person who does that. I know, I said. Neither did he. A long pause. That's not comforting, he said. No, I agreed. It's not. Outside the coffee shop window, the sky had cleared to a thin, pale blue. Not warm yet. Not the kind of blue that promises anything. Just clear and cold and wide. The kind of sky that doesn't ask anything of you except to keep moving forward through it. We sat there a while longer. Neither of us said much. But we stayed at the table. And for the first time in 3 years, that felt like something. Oh, the audit report landed on a Tuesday. I know because I had been counting the days without meaning to. The same way I'd counted the floors in Graham Holloway's elevator. That automatic internal tracking system that kicks in when your brain understands something significant is approaching and doesn't know what else to do with the anticipation. 14 days since the board meeting. 11 since the coffee shop with Ethan. 8 since Philip Garrett had filed the formal challenge to the directive on Ethan's behalf, despite everything we'd discussed across that table with the paper cups between us. That last part, I want to be honest about it, hurt more than I expected. Not because I'd been naive enough to believe that one conversation in a coffee shop would undo years of conditioning. Not because I thought Ethan had walked out of that booth a changed man, ready to fold his hands and accept consequences with grace and humility. I'm not that person. I've never been that person. But something had passed between us that morning that felt real. Something unscripted and unguarded and genuinely human. And then 4 days later, his attorney filed papers arguing that our father had been mentally compromised and unduly influenced. Unduly influenced. which in the specific language of estate law is a way of pointing at someone without naming them, and the someone being pointed at was me. I read the filing in Marcus's office, standing, because I couldn't make myself sit down. He's following his attorney's advice, Marcus said. He was trying to be fair. I understood that. Philip Garrett is doing what he's paid to do. I know, I said. It doesn't mean the conversation you had with him wasn't real. I know that too, I said. But knowing a thing and feeling it are different operations entirely, and I won't pretend otherwise. I set the filing down on Marcus's desk and looked out his two-sided windows at the overcast city and felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has been trying to hold something together from the inside while someone else throws things at it from the outside. It was Tuesday morning. The audit report arrived at 11:47. I was in a meeting with two members of the operations team, reviewing vendor contracts, the kind of unglamorous, necessary work that keeps a company functional and that nobody at the executive level ever wants to deal with, when Marcus's assistant knocked on the glass door and held up a single finger. 1 minute. I excused myself, walked into the hallway. Marcus was already there, holding a bound document that was thicker than I'd expected. He handed it to me without preamble. Read the executive summary first, he said. Then we'll talk. The executive summary was 6 pages. By page 3, I had to stop and put the document down on the windowsill and breathe for a moment. Not because the findings were surprising. I had expected something significant. The conditions that had produced the final directive were not the conditions of minor irregularities, and I had spent enough time in the operational infrastructure of this company to understand that the damage Ethan had done wasn't superficial. But seeing it documented, quantified, sourced, laid out in the precise, effectless language of forensic accounting, was different from understanding it in the abstract. It was the difference between knowing that a structure has been compromised and standing inside it, while someone shows you exactly which load-bearing walls have been hollowed out. 31 separate transactions over a 47-month period. Total value extracted, just under $4 million, moved through 3 subsidiary structures, 2 of which had been established specifically to obscure the trail. The target division, operations and infrastructure, the division. I had spent a year and a half stabilizing without knowing why it kept bleeding, had been systematically undervalued through a combination of deferred maintenance accounting and manipulated performance metrics. The external acquisition firm that had been positioned to purchase the division, the one in which Ethan held undisclosed interest, had submitted a preliminary offer 6 weeks before my father died. The offer had been declined by the board on the grounds that the valuation was inconsistent with the company's internal assessments. My father had declined it personally. He had been sitting on the knowledge of what Ethan had done, watching his son position himself to profit from the destruction, and he had quietly, without explanation or confrontation, blocked the acquisition. And then he had gone home and written it all down. I stood at that window for longer than I should have. The document was in my hands, and the city was outside the glass, and somewhere in the building below me, 387 people were doing their jobs, answering emails, making decisions, building things, completely unaware that the ground they were standing on had been compromised, and that the person who had compromised it was still, as of that morning, filing legal challenges to the instrument that had been designed to protect them. Marcus gave me time. That was one of the things about Marcus Webb. He understood the value of giving people time to absorb things before he started asking them to respond. When I came back to him, I said, "What happens now?" "The report goes to the estate attorneys and the board," he said. "Graham Holloway gets a full copy today. The legal proceedings around the directive will incorporate these findings." He paused. Philip Garrett's challenge becomes significantly harder to maintain in the face of this level of documentation. Significantly harder, I repeated. Not impossible. Estate litigation is never impossible, Marcus said, with the particular honesty of a man who had been in business long enough to know that money and a skilled attorney could keep almost anything alive longer than it deserved. But the challenge rests on the argument that your father was not of sound mind or was acting under someone's influence. This audit demonstrates a 2-year investigative process of extraordinary precision. That's not the work of a compromised mind. I was right. I knew he was right. But I also knew that knowing something is right and having it feel settled are still different things. And nothing about this felt settled. Nothing about any of it. Not the audit, not Ethan's filing, not my new interim role. Not the 47 months of quiet damage laid out in 6 pages of executive summary. Felt like it was approaching resolution. It felt like standing at the edge of something that was still falling. The second call from Ethan came that same afternoon. I almost didn't answer it. I was back at my desk, working through the vendor contracts that had been interrupted that morning, when his name appeared on my phone screen. I looked at it for 3 rings, then I picked up. "I assume you've seen the audit report," I said before he could speak. A silence. "Philip sent me a summary," he said. "Then you know." Another silence, longer. "Naomi, don't." My voice came out harder than I'd intended, not shouting, just hard, like something that had been soft for too long and had finally stopped accommodating. "Don't start with my name like it's a negotiation opener. You filed papers 4 days after we sat across from each other, and you told me, you implied, that you understood what was at stake. And then your attorney filed a document suggesting that I manipulated our father. That's not what the filing says." Undue influence, Ethan. That's the legal term. You want to tell me who that's pointing at? He didn't answer. "I went to that coffee shop because I thought you were ready to have an honest conversation," I said. "I told you about the provision in the directive, but the path your father built in, the one that actually gives you something if you're willing to be accountable. And then you went and filed a challenge that is going to cost both of us time and money and make every single thing harder than it needs to be. So yes, I've seen the audit, and I'd like you to tell me what exactly you were hoping I would say right now." The silence on his end was different from his other silences. Not calculating, not performing patience, just quiet. "Philip advised me that the challenge was necessary to protect my legal position," he said finally. "Philip is paid to protect your legal position," I said. "He's not paid to protect your future, or this company, or anything that will matter to you 10 years from now. Those are different things." "You sound like him," Ethan said. I didn't have to ask who he meant. It stopped me. Not because it was flattering. I wasn't sure it was meant to be. But because it was the first time in my memory that Ethan had compared me to our father in a way that wasn't dismissive. The first time it had sounded, even faintly, like something other than a weapon. "Maybe," I said. "He wasn't always wrong." A sound from Ethan's end, something between a breath and something harder to name. "The audit," he said. "The numbers. Are they—" He stopped. "Is it as bad as the summary made it look?" I thought about the 6 pages. The 31 transactions. The $4 million and the hollow walls. "Yes," I said. "It's exactly as bad." He didn't say anything. "The board is meeting on Friday," I said, "to review the findings and determine next steps on the estate proceedings. If you're going to make any decisions about the Garrett strategy, you need to make them before then. Because after Friday, the shape of this changes." "How?" "Because once the board formally incorporates the audit into the estate record, your father's position becomes part of the legal foundation that everything else is built on. Right now, there's still some ambiguity in the procedural timeline. There won't be after Friday." I don't know why I told him that. I've thought about it since. It wasn't strategic. Not in a way that benefited me anyway. It might have been residue from the coffee shop, from that moment when he'd said, "I don't know how to be the person who does that," without any performance in his voice at all. It might have been the part of me that is, despite everything, still his sister. Or it might have been something my father would have done, leaving a window open, even when the door had been closed. "I'll talk to Philip," Ethan said. "Okay. I'm not promising anything." "I'm not asking you to," I said. "I'm telling you where the timeline is. What you do with it is your decision." I hung up. My hands were not entirely steady when I set the phone down. The board meeting on Friday was the longest 3 hours of that month, which was a month that already contained a funeral, a will reading, a forensic audit, and a coffee shop conversation that had taken more out of me than I'd expected. All 7 board members were present. Graham Holloway attended as legal representative of the estate. Marcus ran the meeting with his characteristic efficiency, moving through the agenda items in order, allowing discussion without letting it become performance, keeping the temperature in the room at a functional level even when the content of what was being discussed wanted to push it higher. The audit findings were presented in full. A forensic accountant named Dr. Renata Cross, small, precise, with the calm authority of someone who has spent a career being the person in the room who has actually done the math, walked the board through the documentation. She answered questions without hedging. When a board member asked whether the findings were consistent with intentional misconduct rather than negligence or error, she said yes, without qualification. The word intentional moved through that room the way cold air moves through a gap, finding every space, filling it completely. There was discussion about the estate proceedings, about the legal challenge filed by Philip Garrett and its viability in the face of the audit record. Graham was measured and precise. Garrett's argument rested on undermining the directive, and the directive was now supported by 2 years of documented investigation, 3 independent mental competency assessments, and a forensic audit confirming the core of every claim the directive made. The challenge was not dead. These things were never technically dead, but it had become, in Graham's words, extremely difficult to maintain credibly. Then Marcus said, "There's been a development this morning that the board should be aware of." I looked at him. He looked at me. "Ethan Mercer has notified his attorney that he is withdrawing the legal challenge to the directive," Marcus said. Effective this morning, Graham received formal notification at 9 a.m. The room went quiet. I had not known this was coming. I want to be clear about that, not because it changes the outcome, but because I think honesty about my own experience is the only thing that makes any of this worth telling. I had told Ethan about the Friday timeline. I had not known whether he would act on it. I had not allowed myself to expect it. And sitting in that boardroom, hearing Marcus say those words, I felt something shift in my chest that I couldn't immediately name. Not triumph, not relief exactly, though relief was somewhere in there. Something closer to grief's quieter cousin. The feeling of a tension finally releasing that you've held so long, you'd started to believe it was a permanent part of your body's architecture. "He's also submitted a letter," Graham said. He reached into his file and removed a single page. "To the board and to the estate. He's requested that it be read into the record." Marcus nodded. Graham read it. It was not a long letter. Ethan was not, whatever else he was, a man given to extended emotional prose. But it was, and I am choosing this word carefully because I think it's the accurate one, honest. He acknowledged the transactions. He didn't soften them or contextualize them or bury them in qualifications. He stated that the audit findings were accurate. He stated that the conduct documented over the 47-month period had been intentional and had caused material harm to the company. He did not explain why. He did not construct a narrative of justification or pressure or circumstance. He just said, "It was wrong, and I knew it was wrong, and I did it anyway." 6 sentences. That was all. By the time Graham finished reading, the room was very still. One of the board members, a woman named Patricia Sohn, who had been with the company almost as long as Marcus, looked across the table at me and said quietly, "Your father would have," and then stopped herself because she was a careful woman and she understood that finishing that sentence was beyond what the moment called for. But I heard it anyway. "Your father would have." Yes, I thought. He would have. Whatever he would have felt, whatever complicated combination of grief and pride and regret and love that a man like Dorian Mercer would have assembled in response to his son finally, painfully, publicly telling the truth, I carried a version of it in that boardroom. Not his version, mine, but something in the same family. After the meeting, in the hallway, Marcus pulled me aside. "How are you doing?" he asked. It was such a simple question, such a normal, human question, asked in the middle of all this abnormality. "I don't know yet," I said. He nodded like that was a completely acceptable answer. "The board wants to move forward with the estate resolution," he said. "Given the withdrawn challenge and the completed audit, the legal path is cleaner now. Graham estimates we're looking at 6 to 8 weeks to formal settlement. And the trustee appointment? Will follow the estate settlement," he said. "Naomi," he paused. "You understand what your father built here?" "I think so," I said. "No." He said it gently but firmly. "I don't think you do. Not yet. I think you've been so focused on keeping this thing from falling apart that you haven't had a moment to actually look at what's going to be in your hands when this is resolved." I looked at him. "This company," he said, "in the right hands, with the right leadership, and I want to be very clear that I am talking about you, can do things your father never imagined, not because he wasn't capable of imagining them, but because he spent so much energy protecting what he'd built that he never had enough left over to think about what it could become." I stood in that hallway for a moment with the weight of that settling over me. Not comfortable weight. Not the easy kind. The kind that means something is real. 6 to 8 weeks, I said. Give or take. All right, I said, then I've got work to do. Marcus almost smiled. It was the closest he usually got. I walked back to my office, sat down at my desk, opened the vendor contracts from Tuesday morning that had been sitting untouched in the corner of my screen for 3 days, and I went back to work. Because that is what you do. Not because it's glamorous, not because it feels heroic, but because 387 people showed up that morning expecting the floor to hold, and the least I could do was make sure it did. But late that afternoon, when the building had gone quiet and the sky outside had turned that particular bruised purple of early winter evenings, I sat back in my chair and thought about my father for a long time. About the letter Ethan had written. About the 6 honest sentences that had taken him 40-some years of living and a forensic audit and a sealed envelope from a dead man to arrive at. About what it must have cost him to write them. About what it must have cost my father to believe, for 2 full years of watching and documenting and staying silent, that the cost was one his son might eventually be willing to pay. 2 men. Neither of them capable of saying the necessary thing while there was still ordinary time to say it. Both of them arriving at something like truth only through crisis, only through the collapse of every other available option. I didn't know if that was tragic or just human. Maybe again, it was both at once, outside my window. The city was turning its lights on, one by one, the way cities do. Not all at once, not dramatically, just incrementally, block by block, until the dark is full of small bright things that were always there but are only visible now that the day has finally, completely, let go. I watched it happen, and I stayed at my desk. 6 weeks is not a long time in the life of a company. In the context of everything that had happened, the funeral, the conference room, the sealed envelope, the audit report. Ethan's letter read into the board record in a voice carefully stripped of commentary. 6 weeks felt both very short and very long at the same time. Short because the legal machinery of estate settlement, once it gets moving, has its own momentum and its own schedule and doesn't particularly care how you're feeling about the pace. Long because I was living inside it, day by day, carrying the weight of interim authority in a company that was watching me very carefully to see whether I would hold. People watch you differently when they know something significant is happening. Not obviously, not with the kind of open staring that you could address or confront. More like peripheral attention. The kind where you feel eyes track to you when you enter a room and conversations adjust slightly when you're within earshot, and people are just a fraction more careful with their words in your presence than they would otherwise be. I understood it. I didn't enjoy it, but I understood it. The company was in a period of uncertainty, and uncertain people look for signals about whether the ground is going to hold. I was the signal they were watching. Every decision I made in those 6 weeks, every vendor contract reviewed, every staffing question resolved, every budget call attended, was being read not just as operational management, but as evidence. Evidence of what kind of leader was going to be standing at the front of this thing when the formal settlement finally came through. I tried not to think about that too directly. Thinking about it directly made me self-conscious in a way that was counterproductive, made me perform steadiness rather than simply being steady, which are not the same thing and people can always tell the difference, so I just did the work. And the weeks moved. The formal estate settlement meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in Graham Holloway's conference room. The same 14th floor, the same controlled quiet. 6 weeks after the reading of the will, we were going back. The night before, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark of my bedroom and listened to the city doing its night sounds. A car somewhere below, a distant siren that faded before it resolved into anything specific, the particular low hum that cities make when they think no one is listening. And I thought about my father in the way I'd been carefully not thinking about him for 6 weeks. Because the work had required a certain emotional compartmentalization, and I had maintained it with some effort. He had been 67 years old when he died. He had built a company from a single office with 4 employees into something that employed nearly 400 people and managed assets that had made him, by any conventional measure, extraordinarily successful. He had done this through a combination of intelligence and aggression and relentless grinding discipline, and almost none of it had come easily. And almost none of the cost had been distributed fairly among the people around him. His first marriage, to my mother, who had left when I was 9 and Ethan was 12, had not survived the company. His second marriage to Celeste had survived it, but only because Celeste was exceptionally skilled at absorption, at making herself smaller when the pressure increased, at not requiring things he didn't know how to give. His relationship with Ethan had been a mirror that eventually cracked. His relationship with me had been a window he never quite opened. And at the end of it, with his health failing and the company he'd built being quietly hollowed out by the son he'd poured so much of himself into, he'd sat down and written letters. Careful, precise, documented letters. He'd engaged a forensic accounting firm through a private channel. He'd met with his attorney in person and handed over a sealed envelope. He'd done all the things he knew how to do. The things he didn't know how to do. The simpler, more devastating ones, like sitting across from me and saying, "I see you," out loud, with his actual voice, in actual time, those he'd left for the envelope to carry. I thought about that for a long time in the dark. I wasn't angry about it anymore. I'd been angry, in the early weeks, not in a loud way, not in a way I showed anyone, but in the quiet internal way of someone processing a loss that's complicated by the fact that what you lost was already imperfect. You grieve the thing and simultaneously grieve the better version of it that you needed and never had. And those are two different griefs running alongside each other, and it takes time to sort them out. By the night before the settlement meeting, I had sorted out enough. He was my father. He was limited by the architecture of himself in ways I don't think he ever fully understood. He had tried, at the end, in the only language available to him. That was what I had. That was all I was going to get. And lying there in the dark, I decided, not dramatically, not with any ceremony, just quietly and finally, that it was enough. Not enough in the sense of satisfying or fair or what I deserved. Enough in the sense of sufficient, enough to move forward with. I fell asleep sometime around 2 in the morning. I was in Graham's conference room by 8:45 bad. The configuration of the room was different this time, not physically. Same table, same leather chairs, same art on the walls, same controlled quiet. But the arrangement of people had changed. Marcus Webb was there, which he hadn't been at the reading. 2 additional board members attended as observers. Graham had a second attorney present, a younger woman named Sandra Cho, who handled the technical estate documentation with the efficient precision of someone who had done this many times and understood exactly how much attention each element required. Ethan was there. I was sitting when I arrived, which meant he'd arrived before me, which I hadn't expected. He was wearing a gray sweater instead of a suit, the first time I could remember seeing him in a meeting setting without the full armor of formal business dress. It made him look younger, also more tired. The two things together created an impression that was harder to be in the same room with than his usual polished certainty, because certainty is something you can hold yourself against. And this wasn't certainty. This was just a person. He looked up when I came in, nodded once. I nodded back, sat down. Celeste arrived 2 minutes later with the same quiet precision she brought to everything. She sat beside me without ceremony and briefly, under the table, pressed her hand over mine. 1 second. Then she withdrew it and folded her hands in her lap and looked at Graham. Ready. Graham began. The formal settlement proceeded in the measured language of legal resolution. Acknowledgments of the withdrawn challenge. Confirmation of audit findings incorporated into the estate record. Verification of the mental competency documentation, and the chain of custody for the final directive. Sandra Cho moved through the technical sections with quiet efficiency. Marcus listened without expression. The 2 board member observers took occasional notes, and then Graham reached the section on distribution. He looked at each of us before he started reading. The same thing he'd done at the original reading, that brief, deliberate survey of the room. I remembered it from 6 weeks ago. It felt different now. Less like assessment and more like acknowledgement. He began with Ethan. Per the terms of the directive and the conditions activated by the audit findings, Ethan's claim to the primary estate, the financial assets, the property portfolios, the controlling interest, was formally extinguished. That was the legal language. Extinguished. A word that felt more final than it probably needed to. But estate law doesn't particularly concern itself with emotional texture. Ethan did not move. He sat with his hands flat on the table in front of him and looked at a fixed point somewhere between the document and the middle distance, and his face was very still. Not the performed stillness of 6 weeks ago, in this same room, when he'd been recalibrating in real time and the stillness was a strategy. This was something else. This was a person sitting with a consequence they had accepted, and the sitting was hard, and they were doing it anyway. I watched him for a moment, Then I looked back at Graham. The directive's provision, the path my father had built in, the one I'd told Ethan about in the coffee shop, was read next. Ethan would receive no share of the primary estate. However, upon completion of a formal restitution process overseen by the board and independent legal counsel, and upon a demonstrated period of structured accountability, not less than 18 months, with quarterly review, he would be eligible for consideration of a negotiated role within the company, not a leadership position, not operational authority, a defined supervised entry-level role in a division other than the ones he'd previously managed. It was, in every practical sense, starting from the bottom. In Ethan's case, that was also starting from a place of having done damage that would take years to fully repair. The restitution process alone, repaying the extracted value through a structured arrangement, would occupy a significant portion of whatever financial resources he still had access to. It was not a gift. My father had not built it as a gift. He'd built it as an opening, narrow, conditional, hard-edged, the kind of opening that only has value if the person who walks through it is willing to do so without expectation of ease. Ethan's jaw moved slightly when Graham read the 18-month timeline. That was the only visible reaction. Then he went still again. Graham turned to Celeste. Graham, the provision for Celeste was, and this surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have, genuinely generous. Not in the complicated, conditional way of the rest of the estate. Simply generous. The family property in the mountains, left to Celeste outright. A financial arrangement that provided her with security, independent of any ongoing estate proceedings or company decisions. A personal letter from my father, which Graham produced in a separate sealed envelope and handed to her directly, saying only that it was to be read privately and was not part of the formal record. Celeste took the envelope with both hands. She held it in her lap for the rest of the meeting without opening it, and I did not look at her face, because some things deserve privacy even in rooms full of people. Then Graham looked at me. I had known this was coming. I had known the outline of it from the directive, from Marcus's conversations with me over the preceding weeks, from the logic of everything my father had constructed. I had known it intellectually, the way you know the shape of something before you've actually touched it. Knowing and arriving are still different things. Graham read the formal designation of primary heir and trustee. The financial assets. The controlling interest in Mercer Capital Holdings. The responsibility, and my father had used that word specifically, responsibility, not privilege or reward, of carrying the family name in the company forward. My name. In my father's words, delivered by his attorney in the 14th floor conference room where 6 weeks ago I had pressed my hand to my mouth and not cried. I did not cry now either, but I felt the full weight of it land, not as triumph, not as vindication, though those things were somewhere in the room too, as weight. Genuine, serious, going to be with me for a long time weight. After Graham finished reading, Sandra Cho moved through the signature process. Documents signed, witnessed, notarized. The legal machinery completing its final rotation and coming to rest. When it was over, Marcus stood and offered his hand to me across the table. I shook it. He nodded. That almost smile again. And gathered his things and left with the 2 board observers, quiet and efficient and without ceremony, the way he did everything. Graham and Sandra began consolidating the documentation. The room started its process of becoming an ordinary conference room again, the charged atmosphere of the last 2 hours gradually releasing. I became aware of Ethan standing near the door. He hadn't left yet. He was putting on his coat, the ordinary, slightly effortful business of getting ready to go back out into a world that had fundamentally rearranged itself. And he looked up and caught me looking at him. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he said, "Naomi." Yeah, he seemed to be working towards something. I could see it. The effort of a person trying to say a thing they don't have a practiced language for. Ethan had a language for negotiation, for persuasion, for the particular verbal architecture of getting what he wanted from people. He did not have a language for this. The letter, he said finally, that I wrote, to the board. I know. I meant it, he said. I want you to know that. Not as a strategy, not because Philip told me it was my best option. He paused. I meant it. I looked at him. I know, I said again. And I did. I had known it when Graham read it in the boardroom, in the particular quality of its plainness. You can feel the difference between a strategic apology and an honest one. They have different weights. Ethan nodded, put his hands in his coat pockets. 18 months is a long time, he said. Yes, I agreed. I've never done anything that looked like what that provision describes. Supervised, quarterly review. He said the words with a kind of careful neutrality that I understood was him trying not to let the humiliation of them show too directly. I don't know if I can do that. You can, I said. Whether you will is a different question. He looked at me for a moment. That's something he would have said, Ethan said. Maybe. A silence between us. Not hostile, not warm, just present. The silence of two people who share a history that is complicated and irreducible and not going away, who are standing at the first possible moment of something different without any guarantee of what that different thing will actually look like. I'll see you around, he said. You will, I said. He left. The door closed behind him and the room was quiet again. Celeste was still sitting at the table. She had the unopened envelope in her hands, turning it slowly, not looking at it. When the door closed, she looked up at me. Are you all right? She asked. It was the same question I had asked her 6 weeks ago in the hallway after the reading. The same words, reverse direction. Getting there, I said. She nodded, looked back at the envelope. Do you want me to stay? I asked. While you read it? She thought about it, really considered it. I could see her weighing it. No, she said gently, but thank you. I gathered my things, said goodbye to Graham, who shook my hand and told me, with the precise, calibrated warmth of a man who had spent 14 years watching my father from close range, that he thought the company was in good hands. I thanked him. I walked down the hallway to the elevator, pressed the button, and while I waited, something happened that I hadn't expected. Something small and entirely physical and completely beyond my control. My hand started shaking, not dramatically, just a fine, sustained tremor, the kind your body produces when it has been holding something at high tension for a very long time, and the tension has finally been released. I pressed my palms flat against my thighs and breathed. The elevator arrived. I stepped in. And this time I didn't count the floors. But 3 days after the settlement, I received a package at my office. No return address on the outer envelope. My name written in handwriting I didn't immediately recognize. Neat, a little cramped, the handwriting of someone who didn't write by hand often and was concentrating on doing it clearly. Inside was a single item, a photograph. It was taken at the company's 25th anniversary event. I remembered the event vaguely. I had been maybe 15 at the time, brought along as a family appendage to a business occasion I hadn't understood. In the photograph, the main hall of some event space, a long table, company staff in the background. In the foreground, my father, younger by over 2 decades, in a dark suit. Standing beside him, looking up at something off camera, a girl of about 15 in a blue dress. Me. My father's hand was on my shoulder. I have no memory of that moment. I have no memory of him touching me like that. Easy, natural, unremarkable. The way parents touch children when they're not thinking about it, when it's just reflex, just presence. But there it is in the photograph. There it is. On the back, in that same careful handwriting, found this in his desk when we cleared the office. Thought you should have it. See Celeste. I sat at my desk for a long time holding that photograph. The company moved around me, phones and footsteps, and the ordinary productive hum of a living organization, all 387 of its people going about the business of the day, building things, solving things, showing up. My father's hand on my shoulder. Neither of us looking at the camera, neither of us performing anything, just there, together. In an unremarkable moment at a company party 20-some years ago, when I was 15 and he was in his prime, and neither of us had any idea what the future was going to cost us. I set the photograph on my desk, propped against the small lamp in the corner where I could see it from where I sat. Then I opened my laptop, and I went back to work. The photograph stayed on my desk for months. Not as a shrine, not as a performance of sentiment for anyone who walked into my office. And people did walk in, increasingly, as the weeks after the settlement turned into a rhythm of actual leadership rather than provisional survival. It stayed because every time I looked up from whatever I was working on, it reminded me of something I needed to keep remembering. That the story I'd been telling myself about my father, the version where he was simply cold, simply absent, Simply a man who had chosen his company over his children and his pride over his relationships was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The photograph was the part that didn't fit that story. The unremarkable, unposed, completely unconscious hand on a 15-year-old girl's shoulder. He had loved me. And the broken, insufficient, chronically unexpressed way of a man who had been built by hard circumstances into someone who treated softness as a liability. He had loved me and failed me simultaneously, and both of those things were real, and I was going to have to live with the complexity of that for the rest of my life. I had made my peace with it somewhere between the settlement meeting and the morning I opened the package from Celeste. Not a complete peace. I don't think complete peace is actually available in situations like this, and I'm suspicious of anyone who claims to have achieved it. But a working peace, the kind that lets you function, lets you be present, lets you do the next thing without the weight of the unresolved past pulling every decision sideways. The company needed that from me. The 387 people who showed up every morning needed a leader who was actually there, not someone still processing her grief in the corner office while the operational decisions made themselves. So I was there, and slowly, incrementally, imperfectly, things began to move forward. The first board meeting at which I sat as formal trustee and primary heir rather than interim director happened on a Monday morning, about 8 weeks after the settlement. I had prepared for it the way I prepared for everything, thoroughly, specifically, without drama. I had reviewed every outstanding operational issue, every pending vendor negotiation, every staffing question that had been sitting in provisional status during the uncertainty of the preceding months. I had a clear agenda, and I had thought through the questions the board was likely to ask. What I had not prepared for was the particular quality of the silence in the room when I walked in. Not hostile, not uncertain, just attentive. Every person at that table was looking at me with the specific focus of people who had been waiting to see something and were now, finally, seeing it. Marcus was already seated. He looked at me and gave one of his minimal nods, a fraction more pronounced than usual, which from Marcus was essentially a standing ovation. I sat at the head of the table. It was the chair my father had occupied for over 30 years. It was slightly different from the others. Same material, same general design, but positioned in a way that the room organized itself around it. I had sat in that chair exactly once before, at his insistence, when I was about 22 and visiting the office, and he'd been on a phone call that ran long and gestured for me to take his seat while he finished. I'd lasted about 90 seconds before it felt wrong, and I moved to a different chair. Now I sat in it, and it felt not comfortable. Not yet. But it felt like mine in a way that had nothing to do with inheritance paperwork and everything to do with the 18 months I'd spent doing the work that needed doing in the building below me. "Let's begin," I said. And we did. Bam. The first significant test of my leadership, the one that I think actually defined what kind of trustee I was going to be, didn't come from the board or the audit aftermath or the ongoing restitution process that Ethan had formally entered. It came from a woman named Joelle Park. Joelle was 54 years old and had worked in the company's mid-level operations division for 19 years. She had been there longer than most of the current senior staff, longer than 2 of the current board members, long enough that she remembered what the company had looked like before Ethan had started redirecting resources away from her division's infrastructure budget. She came to my office on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 months after the settlement, and knocked on the open door with a precision that suggested she had been considering whether to do this for some time and had finally committed. "Ms. Mercer," she said, "do you have a few minutes?" "Come in," I said. "And it's Naomi." She sat down across from me with the careful posture of someone who is not accustomed to sitting across from the person at the top of the building. "I want to talk to you about the Morrison Street team," she said. The Morrison Street team was a group of 11 people in facilities management, the kind of work that keeps a company's physical infrastructure functional and that nobody thinks about until something breaks. They had been operating for 2 years with equipment that was overdue for replacement, a budget that had been cut 3 times in the period covered by the audit, and a staffing level that required people to regularly cover roles that should have been filled by additional hires. I knew this because it was in the audit report. What I didn't know was what it had felt like from the inside. Joelle told me, not dramatically, not with an agenda beyond the simple, direct agenda of someone who has watched people work too hard for too long with too little and has finally found someone she thinks might actually listen. She told me about the equipment failures they'd managed without reporting because reporting meant justifying costs that always seemed to get cut anyway. About the 2 people who had quietly left in the last year because they couldn't sustain the workload. About the way the division had simply absorbed the damage and kept functioning, because that's what people do when they care about their work and don't have any other options. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't take notes while she was talking. I didn't want her to feel like she was giving a presentation. I just listened, the way I wished more people had listened in this building for the last several years. When she finished, she looked at me with the cautious expression of someone who has said a difficult thing and is waiting to find out what it costs. "How long have you been sitting on this?" I asked. "Sitting on what?" "The frustration," I said. All of it. How long have you been watching this happen and not saying anything?" She was quiet for a moment. "Since about the time it became clear that saying something wasn't going to change anything," she said. "That landed somewhere specific and uncomfortable." "It's going to change something now," I said. "I want a full assessment of the Morrison Street team's equipment and staffing needs on my desk by the end of the month. Not a trimmed-down version, not a version that preemptively accounts for what you think I'm willing to approve. The actual number. What it actually takes." She looked at me for a moment like she was verifying that she'd heard correctly. "Okay," she said. "And Joelle?" She had started to stand. She paused. "Thank you for coming in." She nodded once, with the restrained dignity of someone who has been told thank you too rarely and isn't quite sure what to do with it. Then she left. I turned back to my desk, and I thought about my father, about the fact that this division, these 11 people, this equipment, this quietly absorbed damage, had been right here the whole time, in his building, under his name, and he had either not known, or had not looked closely enough, or had trusted the wrong people to look in his place. I thought about what Marcus had said to me in the hallway after the board meeting. "You've been so focused on keeping this thing from falling apart that you haven't had a moment to actually look at what's going to be in your hands." I was looking now, and what was in my hands was not just an inheritance. It was a consequence. The consequence of 4 decades of building without always checking what the building was doing to the people inside it. I could not undo that. I could not go back and restore the 2 years of budget cuts, or the 2 employees who had left, or the equipment failures that had been absorbed without complaint. But I could make the next decision correctly, and the one after that. That was the job, not the dramatic resolution, not the vindication, just the next correct decision, and the one after that, for as long as the responsibility was mine to carry. Ethan started his structured accountability period 4 months after the settlement. He had spent those 4 months in what I can only describe, based on the limited contact we had during that time, as a genuine reckoning with himself. Not a performed one, not the kind of visible self-improvement that people undertake when they want credit for the process rather than the result. Something quieter and less public than that. He had engaged an attorney independent of Philip Garrett, someone who specialized in the kind of financial restitution process the directive had outlined. He had begun the complicated, methodical work of accounting for the extracted value and structuring a repayment arrangement that was realistic relative to his actual remaining assets. He had not contacted me much during those 4 months. A few texts. Brief, factual, nothing that required a response beyond acknowledgement. I had appreciated the space. I think he had understood that I needed it, which was itself a kind of growth. Ethan had not historically been someone who paid close attention to what other people needed. The morning he was scheduled to start his supervised role in the company's facilities management division, not the Morrison Street team, a different group, one where his presence would not immediately create complications for people who had already been through enough, I arrived at the office early. Not to see him, or not only to see him, I had a full morning regardless. But when the elevator opened at 7:52 and he walked into the building in a plain jacket and dark trousers, no pocket square, no performance of anything, just a person arriving for work, I happened to be crossing the lobby. We saw each other at the same time. He stopped. I stopped. Neither of us had planned for this moment, which meant neither of us had anything prepared for it, which meant what happened next was just real. "First day?" I said. "Yeah." He looked at me steadily. He looked tired, still. I wasn't sure that would go away quickly. Possibly it shouldn't. "First day." The team lead down there is a man named Vernon Okafor, I said. He's been with the company for 12 years. He's direct, he's fair, and he has no interest in anyone's last name. I paused. He's going to treat you like what you are right now, which is a new person who has to earn it. That's the right approach. Ethan nodded slowly. I know, he said. I know you know, I said. I'm just saying it out loud, so we're both clear on what this is. We're clear, he said. A silence between us. Not the hostile kind, not the careful kind. Just the silence of two people standing in a lobby at 7:52 in the morning with a great deal of history between them and a completely uncertain future ahead. Naomi, he said. I waited. I'm sorry. He said it with the same plainness he'd used in the letter. No performance, no qualification, no construction around it. Just the words. For the filing. For all of it. But specifically for the filing. For pointing it at you. I looked at him. The thing about a genuine apology, the thing that distinguishes it from its strategic cousin, is that it doesn't come with an implicit request for something in return. It lands, and then it just sits there, not waiting, not angling, just present. This was that kind. I know, I said. And then, because honesty required it, it hurt. He nodded. He didn't try to soften that or explain it away. He just accepted it. Okay, I said, go meet Vernon. He adjusted the strap of the bag on his shoulder, looked at me one more moment. Thank you, he said, for the provision, for telling me about it. A pause. You didn't have to do that. No, I agreed. I didn't. He left toward the elevators. I stood in the lobby for a moment and then walked to my office and started my day. It was not a reconciliation. I want to be clear about that. I want to be honest with you, the way I've tried to be honest about everything in this story, because I think you deserve the real version and not the cleaned up one. Ethan and I did not become close after that morning in the lobby. We did not become the siblings we might have been in a different family with a different father and different circumstances. What we became was functional, careful, occasionally honest with each other in ways that felt new and cost something to maintain. He worked his 18 months. He completed the restitution process. He showed up for Vernon Okafor's team and did the work without complaint and without, as far as I could tell, expecting anyone to notice who he used to be. At the end of the 18 months, the board reviewed his case per the directive's provision. I recused myself from that particular vote. It wasn't my call to make, and I didn't want it to be. The board voted to offer him a mid-level position in a different division, still supervised, still conditional, but a step forward. He took it. He's still there, as far as I know, still taking it one step at a time, the way the rest of us do. Not redeemed in any dramatic, cinematic sense, just trying, showing up, doing the next right thing, and then the one after that. That has to be enough, because it's all any of us actually have. Celeste told me about 6 months after the settlement what was in my father's personal letter. She didn't tell me the full contents. It was her letter, and some of it was private in a way I understood without being told. But she told me one thing, over tea at her kitchen table in the house she'd kept after their marriage. The house she'd furnished quietly over 11 years into something that reflected her rather than him. She said my father had written, near the end of the letter, I did not know how to love people the right way. I knew how to love the things I built. I'm sorry that for most of my life I could not tell the difference. She said it quietly, the way you say things that are important and painful and true all at the same time. I held it. I do not know how to build a complete portrait of Dorian Mercer from that sentence. I'm not sure a complete portrait is possible. Not of him, not of anyone, not when you're standing close enough to have been affected by them. What I know is that it was honest, and that he wrote it at the end when honesty was the only currency he had left. I think about it sometimes when I'm at my desk, late in the day, when the building has gone quiet, and the photograph is in its corner, and the city outside is doing its evening thing. I think about the distance between knowing something is wrong and being able to change it while you still have time. About how much of human suffering lives in that gap. My father lived in that gap for most of his adult life. I don't want to. That is the inheritance that matters to me. Not the financial assets, not the controlling interest, not the office with the two-sided windows and the city view. Those things are real, and I take them seriously, and I work every day to carry them responsibly. But the inheritance that actually changed me, the one I think about when I'm tired or frustrated or facing a decision that doesn't have a clean answer, is simpler than any of that. It is the knowledge, hard-won and irreversible, that the people around you are watching, not your performance, not your results, not the version of yourself you present in formal rooms. They are watching what you do when no one is looking, what you protect when protection costs you something, whether the thing you say you value is the thing you actually show up for. My father watched me for 2 years without telling me he was watching. I don't want to be that person. I want to be the kind of leader, the kind of person who says the necessary thing while there's still ordinary time to say it, who doesn't wait for a sealed envelope to carry the words that should have been spoken out loud. I haven't always succeeded at that. I won't always succeed. I am not a different category of human being than the people I've described to you. I have my own gaps between knowing and changing, my own ways of going silent when speech would cost me something I'm not sure I want to spend. But I try. Every day, I try. The last time I visited my father's grave, it was a clear morning in early spring. Not the kind of morning that makes you feel like the world is renewing itself or offering you something. Just a clear morning, cold still, the kind of cold that hasn't decided whether it's leaving yet, the ground damp from the night before. I went alone. I didn't bring flowers. My father had never understood flowers as a gesture, and I didn't want to bring something he would have considered unnecessary sentiment. I stood at the stone for a while without saying anything. There isn't a script for this. There isn't a right way to stand at your father's grave and make sense of everything he was and wasn't, everything he gave you and took from you, everything that got broken, and the imperfect, complicated ways it's been repaired. I didn't try to make sense of it. I just stood there. And after a while I said, out loud, to the stone and the cold air, and nobody in particular, I've got it from here. Not a promise, not a performance, just a statement. A simple, true statement from a person to the person who made her, acknowledging that the baton had been passed and the race was going to continue, and she was going to run it the best way she knew how. Which is all any of us can do. The ground was damp under my feet. My breath made small clouds in the cold air. Behind me, somewhere in the distance, the city was already into its morning, already moving, already building, already full of people doing the next necessary thing. I stayed a little while longer, then I turned around, and I went back to work.